Historiographical interpretations of the relationship between Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism. Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism are among the most controversial and evocative terms that exist within the pages of history. Those familiar with the history of the Soviet Union are aware of how these ideologies were used by Soviet leaders to catalyze Soviet citizens to climb to the dizzying heights of a modern industrialized welfare state and plunge to the cataclysmic lows of bloody terror that claimed the lives of millions within 2 decades. However, the question remains, what was Soviet ideology? What is meant by the terms Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism? Were these concepts part of the trajectory of a single utopian idea genetically destined for catastrophe? Or are these terms 3 distinctly different concepts with variable outcomes that were pushed together by the unpredictable nature of history? Sovietologists have not reached consensus concerning these questions. This is in large part due to the broadness of Marxist thought and the historical complexities of Soviet Russian history, which are reflected in the diversity of Sovietological thought, research, and writing. This essay will analyze how historians of Soviet history have viewed the historical and ideological relationships between Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism. The writings of Noam Chomsky, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Roy Medvedev, Moshe Lewin, Stephen F. Cohen, Theodore von Laue will be used to show the range of academic opinion concerning the connection, or lack thereof, between Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism. The views of the above-mentioned historians fall roughly into either the totalitarian or revisionist schools of Soviet history. In essence, historians of the totalitarian mode of analysis of the Soviet Union, Chomsky, Solzhenitsyn, von Laue, view the Soviet Union as being a monolithic political system that controls society from above via atomization and oppression. Historians of the revisionist school of Soviet history, Lewin, Cohen, Medvedev, focus on both unpredictable historical contingencies and mass reaction as being catalysts for Communist Party policy. Furthermore, the historians mentioned in this essay range from being established academics, Moshe Lewin, Stephen Cohen, Theodore von Laue, to political dissidents, Solzhenitsyn, Medvedev, or both Chomsky. It is important to note that opinion on the relationship between Marxism to Soviet ideology remains a contested topic even within the schools of totalitarian and revisionist Sovietology. For example, while both Chomsky and Solzhenitsyn view the Soviet Union as totalitarian, they have differing views on the nature of Karl Marx's teachings. Solzhenitsyn views Marxism as a bloody abomination, but Chomsky views it as a valuable but unnecessarily mystified method of historical analysis. However, when discussing the relationship between Leninism and Stalinism, there is a clearer consensus. Adherents of the totalitarian mode of analysis tend to view Leninism and Stalinism as either relatively or deeply intertwined. Revisionist Sovietologists such as Lewin, Cohen, and Medvedev separate Leninism and Stalinism clearly by focusing on the more experimental methods of Leninist social control. The diversity of views on the relationship between Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism is emblematic of the range of these ideologies and complexities of Soviet history. Originally written in 1963, Theodore von Laue's Why Lenin, Why Stalin argues that the advent of Leninism and Stalinism stemmed from a Russian desire to resemble the industrialized West. This in turn created a desire for rapid modernization. Von Laue views Bolshevik leaders as utilizing Leninism and Stalinism as ideological and political tools to catalyze Soviet Russia to surpass the level of industrial development of Western countries. Von Laue, though of the totalitarian school of Sovietology, sees clear differences between Marxism and Bolshevism. For von Laue, Marxism was an ingenious mixture of German Romanticism with British industrialism. However, von Laue disparagingly refers to Marxism as a myth whose humanitarian elements became steadily filtered out by Lenin and then obliterated by Stalin. Marxism, according to von Laue, bred arrogance and hubris among Bolsheviks. In addition, Marxism's lack of concrete guidance on how to build a socialist utopia caused constant improvisation in communist practice to be brought into Russian statecraft. The improvising stopped with the rise of Stalin, whom von Laue views as the only Bolshevik strong enough to plunge the USSR into the brutal modernization process that claimed the lives of millions while still managing to preserve the Soviet state from external destruction. Von Laue derided Stalin's political rivals by stating that Zinoviev was a coward and Bukharin was too soft to effectively modernize and stabilize the Soviet Union. Von Laue's monograph, while well-researched, is highly condescending to Soviet Russia. For example, von Laue views the Soviet Union as a backward country desperately attempting to mimic the industrial countries of the West. In essence, the Soviet Union is a pale imitation of the United States. This conclusion causes von Laue to call on Western leaders to improve the quality of life in the West, which in turn would lead the Soviet Union to produce a more sophisticated imitation of Western power. Furthermore, von Laue is seemingly oblivious to the coercive methods of Western capitalist hegemony as he views Soviet Russia through a totalitarian prism. This tendency is evidenced by such comments as, "They, the Soviets, suffer bitterly from the loss of true creativity, of the wholesomeness, of the gentle forces that quietly, unobtrusively, have made the West into the universal model." Ironically, von Laue demonstrates a naivete about the realpolitik of U.S. Cold War policy, which mirrors residents of the Soviet Union who were either unaware or willfully ignorant of the crimes of its leadership. As an American political dissident, who identifies his political and historical views as merging with the anarcho-syndicalist and left-libertarian Marxist philosophies, Noam Chomsky has written a large body of work of multidisciplined academic studies. It is important to note that, like other dissident authors, Solzhenitsyn, Chomsky is not a classically trained historian. Rather, he is a world-renowned biolinguist who has simultaneously devoted himself to left-wing political history and studies of U.S. policy. However, Noam Chomsky has also written valuable work critically analyzing the Soviet Union and Soviet ideology, both in the Chomsky Reader and in his article, The Soviet Union versus Socialism. Chomsky, like Soviet historians of the totalitarian school, looks at Soviet history from a top-down perspective. In his 1986 article, The Soviet Union versus Socialism, Chomsky views Lenin as a rightist deviation from the international socialist movement. To substantiate this view, Chomsky looks to left Marxist theoreticians, such as Rosa Luxemburg and Anton Pannekoek, who, in addition to denouncing Lenin and the Bolsheviks for opportunistic vanguardism, lamented Lenin's dismantling of the Soviets' political power in favor of centralization. Chomsky quotes Pannekoek as saying, "This goal, socialism, is not reached and cannot be reached by a new directing and governing class, substituting itself for the bourgeoisie, but can only be realized by the workers themselves." Within Leninism, Chomsky sees the foreshadowing of Stalinist totalitarianism. In essence, the authoritarian structures that existed under Leninism were expanded by Stalin. Stalinism would have been impossible without Lenin's reconstitution of the czarist systems of oppression, such as the Cheka, secret police, and Lenin and Trotsky's call for unquestioned submission to the single will of the leader. The Bolsheviks' destruction of workers' control, according to Chomsky, meant that the Bolsheviks were destroying socialism as it was always understood by left intellectual opinion, namely workers' control over production. Chomsky states that free expression and organization was destroyed by the Bolsheviks in the interests of socialism by Lenin and Trotsky, who proceeded to create the basic proto-fascist structures converted by Stalin into one of the horrors of the modern age. Chomsky does not lay the blame for the destruction of socialism by Lenin and Stalin solely at the feet of Marxism, which Chomsky sees as having both positive and negative characteristics. According to Chomsky, the strength of Marxism lay in its historical analysis of capitalism and capitalist imperialism. He views Marx as primarily a theorist of capitalism who analyzed its evolution and speculated on where this evolution would lead. In order to substantiate this view, Chomsky cites Marx's anarchist rival Mikhail Bakunin, who, despite his contentious relationship with Marx, praised Marx for his analysis and understanding concerning the rise and nature of capitalism. While Chomsky views Marx's belief in dialectical prophecy as the most speculative element of Marxist theory, problems arise for Chomsky when the suffix ism is applied from without to Marx's name. The suffix of ism or ist denotes a religious mystification to a person who, despite depth of insight and intelligence, will invariably only have partial understandings of a topic. This mystification, often applied to Marx and Freud, turns insightful yet flawed theorists into static idols, an occurrence which Chomsky denounces. In essence, Chomsky sees in Marxist thought the potential for the libertarian socialism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety, or the construction of an unaccountable state priesthood embodied in the phenomena of Bolshevism. Chomsky would praise the former as a realization of Enlightenment humanist aims, while he would denounce the latter as an authoritarian betrayal of working-class aims. Chomsky utilizes a combination of secondary sources from radical leftist historians to describe historical events and primary quotations of leftist intellectuals to substantiate his arguments about intellectual history. Though an opponent of Bolshevism himself, Chomsky utilizes the work of established historians sympathetic to Bolshevism, such as E.H. Carr. However, despite Chomsky's knowledge of Marxist intellectual history and use of historical works that convey the Bolshevik perspective, Chomsky seems reluctant to explore fully the inefficiencies of the independently functioning Soviets immediately following the Bolsheviks' seizure of power, which led to economic collapse and further socio-political instability in post-revolutionary Russia. This is likely due to Chomsky's own libertarian socialist bias and hostility to the Soviet Union, which he refers to as a dungeon. By neglecting to flesh out the practical reasons behind the autocratic policy shift of the Bolsheviks, Chomsky presents an incomplete picture of early Soviet society. This undermines his otherwise perceptive and highly informed work. While Chomsky sees the relationship between Marxism and Leninist, Stalinist totalitarianism as a complicated one, Soviet dissident author Alexander Solzhenitsyn takes a firmer, polemical, reductionist view on the topic. Solzhenitsyn's views on the relationship between Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism can be best found in his autobiographical opus, Gulag Archipelago, and his essay Letter to the Soviet Leaders, in which Solzhenitsyn articulates his historical and political beliefs in the form of policy recommendation to the Soviet political elite. Solzhenitsyn's analysis can be seen as being influenced by his rejection of his former Soviet Marxist beliefs, his sufferings as a Soviet political prisoner under Stalin, and his environment of writing under Soviet authoritarian rule. For Solzhenitsyn, the humanist Western Enlightenment, Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism are part of a destructive linear progression of thought that seeks to perfect humanity at the expense of the soul of the individual. Breaking with many Western Sovietologists of the totalitarian school, such as Theodor H. von Laue, who see Marxism as fundamentally different from Bolshevism, Solzhenitsyn sees Bolshevism as a meticulous application of the Marxist formula. In his essay, Letter to the Soviet Leaders, Solzhenitsyn describes Marxist ideology as being culpable for the brutalization of the Russian people, destroying agriculture via collectivization, and drawing the Soviet government into costly and dangerous foreign policy positions. Solzhenitsyn refers to Marxism as a false, discredited, primitive, and crude, filthy sweatshirt of ideology now stained with the blood of those 66 million. Solzhenitsyn also sees the progressive current that exists within Marxist thought as having weakened the caliber of U.S. national consciousness to the point that it was defeated by tiny North Vietnam, neglecting to mention that North Vietnam defeated the U.S. in the name of Marxist independent nationalism. Solzhenitsyn also spends time illustrating the continuities between Leninist and Stalinist terror in his Gulag Archipelago by describing the existence of arrest, execution, and cannibalization of the radical left that existed continuously from Lenin to Stalin. This process began with Lenin's revolutionary order for merciless suppression at attempts at anarchy on the part of drunkards, hooligans, counter-revolutionaries, and other persons. Solzhenitsyn moves to draw a parallel between Stalin's attack on his fellow Bolsheviks in the 1930s and Bolshevik attacks on other Russian socialists during the Civil War. All these parties, the SRs, the Mensheviks, the anarchists, and the popular socialists, had for decades only pretended to be revolutionaries. They had worn socialism only as a mask, and for that they went to hard labor still pretending. Solzhenitsyn's above-mentioned works were written while in the Soviet Union. To write polemical, anti-Soviet history and political discourse while living under authoritarian Communist Party rule is a testament to Solzhenitsyn's courage and commitment to truth as he saw it. However, while his work articulates the earnest discontent of a thinking man who suffered under the hand of Soviet dictatorship, Solzhenitsyn's analysis is factually incomplete and exaggerated. There can be no doubt that violence, terror, oppression, imprisonment, and mass death occurred in the Soviet Union. The number of Stalin and Lenin's victims is debated among academics. However, Solzhenitsyn's claim that 66 million died as a result of early Soviet oppression is tens of millions of people higher than even the most liberal historical criticisms of Stalin's terror. Furthermore, his critique of Marxism is profoundly shallow. In the section on ideology in Letter to the Soviet Leaders, there is no discussion of philosophical condemnation of Leninism and Stalinism from democratically inclined Western European and left Marxists. There is no mention of Marxism's ability to forecast many of capitalism's present conditions, such as concentration of economic power, the necessity of state intervention to preserve the private economy, the fusion of political and economic power, the decline in the rate of profit, or the need for capitalist states to engage in neo-imperialism to gain access to markets and labor. Solzhenitsyn also offers no hard evidence to link Marxist theory to Bolshevik crime. Like Bolshevik Marxism, Solzhenitsyn relies on decree to substantiate alleged truth. Solzhenitsyn's source material is a mixture of his own research of official Soviet literature and his own experiences and observations while imprisoned. In essence, he was exposed to the simplistic logic of Soviet ideological propaganda and the hearsay of the Gulag. Solzhenitsyn's thought structure and assessment of history, while anti-Soviet, reflect his environment to the detriment of his courageous work. Like Chomsky and Solzhenitsyn, Russian historian Roy Medvedev examines Soviet history from a dissident perspective. However, Medvedev writes as a Khrushchev-era Marxist-Leninist who lays the blame of the wrongs of the Soviet past at Stalin's feet. Written in 1964 and published abroad in 1969, Medvedev's Let History Judge is a nearly 800-page monograph which surveys Soviet history up to 1953 and condemns the crimes of Stalin. Like Solzhenitsyn, Medvedev understandably has a personal bias against Stalin, which stems from Medvedev's father's arrest and death in the gulags. A Communist Party member who wrote during in the Khrushchev era, before being expelled from the party during the Brezhnev era, Medvedev does not question the moral legitimacy of Lenin or question the link between Marxism and Leninism. Instead, Medvedev inverts Stalinist historiography by casting Stalin as the catalyst for evil deviation from orthodoxy rather than as benevolent embodiment of orthodox Marxism-Leninism. Medvedev views Stalinism as completely separate from Marxism-Leninism. For Medvedev, Stalinism is a pseudo-socialism that predicates itself on bureaucracy, violence, and despotism, as opposed to socialism and democracy. Medvedev sees Leninism as being democratic in spirit but realistic in policy. According to Medvedev, Bolshevik tolerance for rival socialist political factions, such as the Socialist Revolutionaries and Mensheviks, was derailed due to the violence of the Civil War, which caused the Bolsheviks to adopt war communism as a means to maintain power and stability. While Medvedev denounces the violence of war communism and Cheka, secret police violence and terror, he nevertheless supports the legitimacy of Leninist political ideals and the October Revolution. Medvedev views Stalin as a usurper of the Bolshevik Party. According to Medvedev, in the aftermath of the Civil War and early years of NEP, Lenin was to write a second part to his political manifesto, State and Revolution, in which Lenin would put forward a general analytical framework that would guide the young Soviet state away from bureaucratization and popular insulation. However, due to Lenin's poor health, this was never completed. Stalin, according to Medvedev, took advantage of the vacuum in Soviet theory and practice in order to consolidate his power by strengthening his position of general secretary and expanding bureaucratic functions of the young Soviet state to promote his own careerist ends. For Medvedev, once this was accomplished, Soviet democracy was strangled. Thus, Stalinist methodology would go on to hamper, rather than accelerate, Soviet development due to the brutalization of the Soviet populace. Interestingly, by the time the 1989 version of Let History Judge was released, Medvedev had ceased to be a marginalized dissident harassed by the KGB and had become a well-known commentator of the Gorbachev era. This is noteworthy due to the fact that Let History Judge was unable to be published in the Soviet Union due to its scathing indictment of Stalin and was published abroad due to a series of domestic and international contacts of Medvedev. This process was similar to the process Solzhenitsyn faced when he was attempting to publish the Gulag Archipelago. Medvedev utilizes a variety of primary sources, namely the political writings of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. However, while dissidents such as Chomsky question or reject Lenin's idealistic political writings as genuine reflections of Lenin's democratic political thought, due to Lenin's violent authoritarianism, Medvedev takes these writings at face value. Medvedev is very much a product of early 1960s Soviet revisionist historiography, which, while unapologetically analyzing the crimes of Stalin, is apologetically sympathetic in its analytical scope to Lenin. In his essay Bolshevism and Stalinism, revisionist Sovietologist Stephen Cohen surveys both secondary and primary accounts of Soviet history to analyze the relationship between Bolshevism and Stalinism. Cohen refutes the straight-line thesis, the view that Marxism leads to Leninism, which leads to Stalinism, of Solzhenitsyn and other Sovietologists of the totalitarian school, by looking at the variable contingencies that surrounded the development of Marxist, Leninist, and Stalinist thought. Cohen sees the claim that Marxism was responsible for suffering in Russia as the weakest aspect of the straight-line thesis, because this claim ignores the fact that any given ideology can influence individuals and events in a variety of ways. For example, Christianity, to which Solzhenitsyn adheres, contributed to both selfless human compassion and bloody inquisition. Marxism similarly led to social justice or tyranny. In sum, this is the nature of broad philosophical concepts. Cohen analyzes the connection of the war communism of the Civil War to Stalinism. He rejects the view that the Bolsheviks' plan for Russia, upon taking power, was a campaign of political terror and forced grain requisition from the countryside. The straight-line thesis states that the Bolsheviks were forced to abandon this plan due to its catastrophic bloody failure and embrace the more moderate NEP. Further, this thesis considers Stalin's collectivization campaign beginning in 1929 as a return to the original Bolshevik desire. Cohen refutes this by stating that the Bolsheviks had no well-defined plan when they came to power in October 1917. They had broad ideas about socialism, workers' control, nationalization, large-scale farming, etc., but had no formulated program for this. This led to experimentation of development models for Soviet modernization. For Cohen, the violence and terror used for shaping society were how the Bolsheviks responded to unplanned circumstances, as opposed to a premeditated desire for bloodletting. Finally, according to Cohen, the view of a straight line between Leninism and Stalinism also ignores the policy debates that occurred within the Communist Party between Bukharin and Trotsky. Both had economic policies that favored the continuation of NEP in varying degrees. Cohen saw Stalin's consolidation of power, shift to forced collectivization policy, and murder of Bukharin and Trotsky as a radical shift in policy at the expense of both the party and the Soviet Union as a whole. Like Cohen, Moshe Lewin is a revisionist Sovietologist who viewed Stalin and Stalinism to be antagonistic and contradictory to Marxism and Leninism. Lewin emigrated to the Soviet Russia from Poland in 1941 in order to escape Nazi invasion. He then worked on collective farms and ultimately served in the Red Army. A sympathizer of Bukharin, Lewin traveled to France after World War II and then to Israel, where he earned his PhD in Soviet studies. In his final monograph, The Soviet Century, Lewin seeks to explain the Soviet Union in historical retrospective. Lewin spends a significant amount of time discussing Lenin's final struggle to prevent Stalin's political ascendancy. For Lewin, Leninism and Stalinism were fundamentally at odds. He views Leninism as an intellectually inclined form of Marxism that stemmed from the Second International, but took on harsh characteristics due to Russia's political instability and lack of socio-economic development. By contrast, Stalinism was distinctly different in origin and character. Where Leninism sought to have Russia arrive at a genuinely mass-based Marxist form of socialism that used the power of the state to discipline the masses, Stalinism sought to increase the power of the state in order to strengthen its bureaucratic capabilities. For Lewin, a key distinction between Leninism and Stalinism lay in Leninism's supposed flexibility of thought and Stalinism's rigidity. For example, Lenin experimented with a variety of development models in his efforts to mold Russia into the initial stages of a socialist state. These methods ranged from pre-revolutionary social democracy to post-revolutionary libertarianism to war communism to NEP. Lewin contrasts Leninism's experimental nature with Stalin's absolutist bureaucratic state that was not composed of Bolshevik idealists, but rather plebeian careerists who sought to join the Communist Party during and after the Civil War was a way to advance their own material well-being. As with Medvedev, Lewin utilizes a plethora of primary documents containing the writings and speeches of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. While sympathetic to Lenin, Lewin's narrative tone contains less palpable admiration for Lenin than Medvedev's does. Lewin is adamant that the concept of totalitarianism is a historically inadequate and purely ideological tool used by Western historians to minimize the historical crimes of the West. Furthermore, the totalitarian paradigm obscures the complexities of Soviet socio-political life by reducing it to a caricature of a perpetual gulag. The power of Marxist idealism and the utilization of Leninist and Stalinist policy to bring modernization and meaning to Russia lay at the core of Soviet history. The historians in this essay have grappled with these concepts with depth of knowledge, topical insight, and historiographical understanding. They sought to understand the relationship between Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism. The complexities of these concepts lend themselves to the fact that there is no static historiographical consensus on how complementary or antithetical these concepts are to one another. However, what can be understood from both a totalitarian and revisionist Sovietologist is that, within the story of the Soviet Union, one finds the earnest desire to merge transcendent truths with the highs and lows of Russian history for the pursuit of a better tomorrow. Bibliography: Chomsky, Noam, The Chomsky Reader, ed. Peck, James. Pantheon Books, New York, 1987. Chomsky, Noam, Soviet Union versus Socialism. Our Generation, Spring-Summer 1986, link, accessed 4/6/2012, Cohen, Stephen F. Bolshevism and Stalinism. Stalinism. Essays in Historical Interpretation. E. Tucker, Robert, Transaction Publishers, New Brunswick, 77. Lewin, Moshe, The Soviet Century, Verso, London, New York, 2005. Marcuse, Herbert. Interview with Brian McGee on Modern Philosophy, Herbert Marcuse, and the Frankfurt School. Link, accessed 5/8/2012. Medvedev, Roy Let History Judge. Columbia University Press, New York, 1989. Rees Arfon, Moshe Lewin Obituary, lively provocative scholar of Soviet social history. Monday, 27 September 2010 link. Solzhenitsyn Alexander, Letter to the Soviet Leaders, Harper and Row, New York, 1974. Solzhenitsyn Alexander, The Gulag Archipelago, Harper and Row, New York, 1973.